Christmas Eve was never meant to feel like this. There were no lights glowing in distant windows, no music drifting across the land, no sound of celebration at all. Only cold air pressing down on the Arizona desert, heavier than it should have been, and a ranger station standing alone against the dark. The station belonged to Ethan Cole, a wildlife ranger who had learned long ago that solitude was both his shield and his burden. The building was a simple structure of steel and concrete designed to endure heat waves, dust storms, and months without human company. On nights like this, it felt less like a workplace and more like a final outpost between order and wilderness. Ethan slept lightly the way men do when silence has trained their instincts. Even in sleep, part of him listened. The radio on the desk hissed with faint static, a thin thread connecting him to a world that felt far away tonight. He had finished his reports earlier than usual, poured a last cup of coffee, and briefly considered calling his brother up north. He decided against it. Christmas had a way of reopening doors better left closed. The sound came just after midnight. It wasn't wind, it wasn't metal shifting in the cold, it was deliberate, slow, heavy. A knock. Ethan's eyes opened instantly. His body followed a heartbeat later, tension flooding his chest as he sat up and listened. The desert had many voices, coyotes calling across the washes, owls cutting through the night, branches scraping stone, but this was none of those. The knock came again, measured, patient, as if whoever or whatever stood outside understood the concept of waiting. Ethan slipped on his boots and crossed the narrow room without turning on the lights. He had learned the value of darkness out here. Curiosity could cost you more than sleep. He checked the locked cabinet where his sidearm rested, then left it there. Some instincts told him to prepare for danger. Others told him something else was happening. He leaned toward the door and peered through the narrow slit of reinforced glass. Darkness pressed back. Then, near the ground, a pale, indistinct shape shifted slightly. Another knock followed, softer this time. Lost hikers crossed his mind. Desperate trespassers, rare medical emergencies. None of them fit the rhythm of what he was hearing. This wasn't panic, it wasn't random, it felt intentional. Ethan eased the latch and opened the door just enough to let a blade of cold air slice across his face. What stood outside erased every plan he had ever made. A lioness filled the doorway, massive and low, her breath fogging the night. Her tawny coat was dulled by dust and streaked with dried blood. One foreleg trembled as she shifted her weight, and along her flank fur had been torn away to reveal an angry, raw wound beneath. Her belly hung heavy and round. She was close to giving birth. Every rule Ethan had ever learned rose up inside him at once. Close the door. Create distance. A mountain lion was not an animal you negotiated with. It was power, instinct, force. But the eyes looking back at him held no hunger, no threat. They were steady, fixed, stripped of anything but endurance stretched to its limit. She did not growl, she did not step forward, she waited. The wind moved through the canyon behind her, carrying the faint scent of snow from higher ground. Ethan remembered the weather alert he had heard earlier, temperatures dropping fast, visibility worsening overnight. Out here, even small injuries became death sentences by morning. The lioness shifted again. Her paw brushed the metal door frame, producing the softest echo of a knock. This one lacked strength. It carried something else. Finality. Ethan didn't speak. He didn't open the door wide. He simply stepped back. It wasn't an invitation he had been trained to give. It was a choice made without language. The lioness gathered what remained of her strength and crossed the threshold. Her body seemed impossibly large inside the station. She took 2 unsteady steps before collapsing onto the concrete floor, the sound of her weight hitting like a breath finally released. Ethan stood frozen, hand still on the door, listening to his own pulse thunder in his ears. Outside, Christmas Eve continued in silence. Inside, nothing in his life would ever be simple again. The ranger station had never felt smaller. Ethan closed the door with care, not because he thought the lioness would try to leave, but because cold had a way of stealing life quietly. The latch clicked into place, and the sound seemed too loud in a room now shared with something that belonged to open land, not steel walls. The lioness lay just beyond arm's reach, her body stretched across the concrete as if she had fallen into sleep mid-step. But she wasn't truly asleep. Ethan could see it in the tension along her shoulders, in the uneven pull of her breathing. Each inhale sounded shallow, strained, as though her lungs were working through pain and exhaustion at the same time. Steam rose from her coat where melting frost dampened the fur. The scent of blood sat sharp in the air mixed with dust and something wild that didn't belong in any human building. Ethan had been near big cats before, always from a distance. Through binoculars across ridgelines behind locked gates at the recovery facility. He respected them the way you respect wildfire, beautiful, dangerous, indifferent. This was different. This was close enough to feel. Part of him urged the practical steps first. Call it in. Contact wildlife response. Follow protocol. The satellite phone sat in the top drawer of the desk. The emergency numbers were taped to the wall beside the map board. But another part of him recognized what the lioness had done by coming here. She hadn't wandered in by accident. She had chosen, and if she had the strength to choose, then she still had the strength to panic if he moved too fast. Ethan forced his breathing to slow. He kept his hands visible. He didn't approach like a man in charge. He approached like someone stepping into a fragile moment that could break with one careless motion. He crouched, watching her eyes. They were half open now. Not focused on him, not locked in warning, but aware. Her left flank was worse than he'd realized. The fur had been ripped away in a jagged line, the skin beneath inflamed and raw. Not actively bleeding, but angry. Recent. He'd seen barbed wire injuries like this on deer. He'd seen what sharp fencing could do when an animal bolted in fear. He also knew predators fought. Territory wasn't polite. Hunger wasn't gentle. He didn't need a report to tell him this lioness had been through something hard. And then there was her belly. Full, low, heavy with life. Ethan stood slowly and moved to the supply cabinet. The first aid kit came down from the shelf. Not the tranquilizer equipment, not the capture gear. He didn't dare. If she was weak enough to be here, drugging her could end her and the lives inside her in one mistake. He filled a shallow metal bowl with water, then slid it across the floor, using the broom handle keeping distance between his body and her head. The bowl scraped quietly. The lioness watched the movement without lifting her chin. For a long moment she did nothing. Then she stretched her neck forward, slow and cautious, and drank. The sound was small, but it landed in Ethan like a heavy stone. He had expected resistance. He had expected aggression. What he was seeing instead was restraint, not his restraint hers. Minutes passed. The radio on the desk hissed with distant static. Outside, the wind moved over the desert like a whisper. Ethan didn't turn on the overhead lights. He kept the stove flame low. The room stayed dim and calm, lit mostly by the faint glow from the heater and the moonlight bleeding through the narrow window. He soaked a clean towel in warm water, wrung it out, and knelt again closer this time. His hands were steady enough to work, but not steady enough to hide what he felt. Fear wasn't the right word. Respect didn't fully cover it either. It was the knowledge that he was touching the edge of something he couldn't control. He spoke quietly, not as a command, not even as comfort. More like a man talking himself through a dangerous climb. Easy, I'm just going to clean it. The towel touched her wound. The lioness's eyes opened fully. Ethan held still, waiting for a snap of teeth, a sudden strike, the kind of fast violence that made big cats so feared. Instead, her breathing hitched once and then steadied. Her gaze stayed on him for a few seconds, measuring, deciding. Then she blinked and looked away. Permission. Ethan worked gently, dabbing and cleaning the torn skin. He didn't scrub. He didn't rush. He treated the wound the way he would treat anything fragile that mattered. He used gauze and tape from the kit wrapping loosely enough not to cut circulation but firm enough to protect the injury. Every movement was slow, deliberate, honest. When he finished, he leaned back, sitting on his heels. The lioness shifted her head not toward the door, not toward the shadows, but toward the floor beside her paws. She lowered her chin and rested it down fully. It wasn't collapse. It wasn't weakness. It was surrender, not to pain, not to death, but to the moment and to the strange safety she had claimed in this room. Ethan felt something inside him loosen. He moved away and sat in the worn armchair near the stove. He pulled a wool blanket over his knees, not because he was cold, but because his body needed something familiar to hold on to. Across the room the lioness lay still, breathing hard but steady, the bandage clean against her flank. The station fell into a new kind of silence, not empty, shared. Ethan stared into the low flame, thinking of all the lines he had lived by: wild stays, wild distance is safety, rules exist for a reason. He thought of how easily a man could lose everything out here by making one wrong choice. And yet when he looked at the lioness again, he knew something he hadn't expected. If he sent her back into the night, she wouldn't make it, and neither would what she carried. He didn't sleep. He watched the slow rise and fall of her chest. He listened to the wind soften outside the storm, settling into a hush. He poured a cup of coffee that went bitter and cold in his hands. At some point near the darkest hour, he realized the truth was already written. The door had opened. A boundary had been crossed. And whatever came next, he would not be able to pretend this was only a job again. Because on a night meant for peace, a wild mother had stepped into his world. And he had let her. The night did not end the way Ethan expected. It didn't fade quietly into rest or settle into a long, careful waiting. Instead, it shifted almost imperceptibly at first, like the moment before a storm decides to break. The lioness stirred. Ethan noticed it in the smallest ways: a change in her breathing, a tightening along her flank, one powerful paw flexing against the concrete floor, claws scraping softly as if searching for earth that wasn't there. The sound cut through the stillness, sharp and unmistakable. He rose from the chair at once, every sense alert. Her breath came faster now, uneven, drawn deep from somewhere low in her chest. She let out a sound that wasn't a growl and wasn't a roar, but something raw and deep, shaped by effort rather than warning. Ethan had heard similar sounds before, though never from a mountain lion. Once during a winter rescue near the border, he had stayed with a mare struggling through labor in freezing conditions. Another time he'd listened to a feral dog cry softly as life pushed its way into the world under a bridge. This was the same language. Life insisting on being born. Ethan backed away, pressing himself to the far wall. This was not a moment for help or intervention. There was nothing he could offer here but space and silence. He glanced once toward the satellite phone, then away again. No one would arrive in time, and deep down he knew this was not meant for witnesses. The lioness shifted onto her side muscles, rippling beneath her coat. Her breathing quickened, then slowed, then quickened again. The room seemed to hold its breath with her. Even the radio fell silent, its static fading, as if it too understood the gravity of the moment. Ethan stood still, hands loose at his sides, heart beating so loudly he wondered if she could hear it. Another low sound came from her throat, followed by a pause that felt endless. Then it happened. A small wet movement, a shape barely more than a suggestion of form, slid into the world. Ethan's breath caught painfully in his chest. The cub was tiny, darkened by birth, its body trembling with weak, instinctive motion. For a terrifying second, it lay still. Ethan clenched his fists, every muscle in his body screaming for action. Then the cub kicked. Once, then again. The lioness turned immediately, her massive head lowering with careful precision. She began to clean the newborn with steady, practiced strokes of her tongue, coaxing warmth and breath into the small body. A faint sound escaped the cub. Not a cry, but something close enough to it that Ethan felt his vision blur. Life! He leaned back against the cabinet, dizzy with relief, and forced himself to breathe again. Minutes passed in silence, broken only by the soft sounds of the mother tending to her young. Ethan watched without moving, afraid that even shifting his weight might break the fragile balance holding the room together. Then her body tensed again. A second wave rolled through her, stronger, this time faster. There was less sound, less struggle, as if her body now remembered what to do. Another small shape followed, slightly smaller than the first, but just as alive. Two cubs, two new hearts beating against the coldest part of winter. Ethan slid down the cabinet and sat on the floor, overwhelmed. He had seen births before. He had documented them, photographed them from safe distances, recorded data for reports and studies. None of that had prepared him for this. This wasn't observation. This was presence. The lioness pulled both cubs close with her foreleg, tucking them against her belly. Her breathing slowed gradually, exhaustion pulling at her but not winning. Her eyes fluttered, half-closed, then opened again, scanning the room once before settling on Ethan. There was no challenge in her gaze, only awareness. He stayed where he was, grounded, silent, letting the moment belong to her. The firelight cast a warm glow across the floor, mixing with the pale gray light beginning to seep through the window. Outside, the storm softened its fury, spent, leaving the world hushed and still. Ethan rose quietly and retrieved an emergency thermal blanket from the shelf. He didn't touch them. He didn't get close. He laid it near the stove, angled just enough to reflect warmth toward the corner where the family rested. Then he sat again. Hours passed without him noticing time at all. The lioness slept lightly, her body curved protectively around her cubs. The cubs nursed weakly, their small movements full of blind determination. Ethan didn't sleep. He watched. He listened. He understood something then that he hadn't allowed himself to feel in years. That presence mattered. That sometimes the strongest thing a person could do was stay and bear witness without trying to control the outcome. When the first gray light of morning finally crept into the station, it did so gently, as if unwilling to disturb what had been born there. Ethan exhaled slowly. The night had asked everything of them, and somehow they had answered. Morning arrived without ceremony. It did not cut through the ranger station in sharp lines of sunlight the way desert mornings usually did. Instead, it seeped in slowly, filtered through low clouds that pressed heavy against the mountains. The light was gray, muted, almost hesitant, as if the world itself was unsure whether it should intrude. Ethan had not moved from the chair near the stove. His body ached in quiet places he usually ignored. His coffee had gone cold hours ago, untouched. The radio still whispered static now and then, but he paid it no mind. Every part of his attention remained fixed on the corner of the room where the lioness lay curled around her cubs. They had not stirred much through the night. The mother breathed deeply now, more evenly than before, her exhaustion finally giving way to rest. The cubs, still blind and impossibly small, pressed close to her belly, their movements slow and instinctive. From time to time, one would twitch or stretch, then settle again, as if reassured by the steady warmth of her body. Ethan rose carefully, testing his stiff legs before standing fully. He moved with deliberate slowness, aware that the smallest sound or sudden motion could undo the fragile trust holding the room together. The stove still held heat, its embers glowing low and steady. He adjusted the flame by hand, watching the temperature climb only slightly. Too much heat could be as dangerous as too little. He crossed to the cabinet and gathered supplies. Clean water, fresh gauze, a small tube of antibiotic ointment from the wildlife medical kit he carried for emergencies. Usually those supplies were meant for deer caught in fencing or coyotes clipped by vehicles. Never for this. Never for a mother and her newborns inside a government ranger station. He knelt at a careful distance and paused, letting her see him. The lioness lifted her head slightly, muscles tightening for a brief moment. Her eyes tracked his movement, sharp and alert despite her exhaustion. Ethan stopped. He waited, After a few seconds, her body relaxed. She did not bare her teeth. She did not rise. She simply watched. Trust, he realized, was not something earned once. It had to be renewed again and again with every choice. He cleaned the wound on her flank quickly and gently, mindful of the cubs pressed against her side. The swelling had already gone down a little. The skin still looked raw but less angry than the night before. She made a low sound when the cloth brushed too close to her belly, not a warning, but a reminder. He adjusted immediately. When he finished rewrapping the injury, he leaned back, careful not to crowd her. She lowered her head again, eyes half closing, one paw drawing a cub closer without looking. Outside, the reserve was waking. Ethan could hear birds testing the morning air, the faint rustle of wind moving through scrub and stone. The storm had passed, leaving behind a world hushed and altered as if it were holding its breath. He sat back in the chair and allowed himself to think, truly think, for the first time since the knock at the door. Protocols would matter soon. Reports, questions, explanations. There would be concerns about safety, liability, property damage decisions that didn't fit neatly into policy manuals. He could already imagine the raised eyebrows, the clipped voices on the radio. But none of that belonged to this moment. Right now there was a mother whose bleeding had slowed. 2 lives that depended on warmth and stillness. A space that had become shelter without anyone planning it. Ethan laid an emergency thermal blanket near the stove, not touching the family, just close enough to help hold the heat. He adjusted the fire again, careful not to change the temperature too quickly. Balance mattered more than force. He had learned that lesson in the wilderness long before this night. The lioness shifted slightly, pulling one cub closer with a precise movement that surprised him with its gentleness. Nothing about her suggested danger in that moment. She was not a predator then. She was simply a mother guarding time. Ethan felt something settle inside his chest. Whatever came next, he knew one truth with quiet certainty. Sending her back into the cold now would be a death sentence. The choice he had made during the night had weight. It was no longer a single act. It was a commitment, one that could not be undone with daylight. He glanced once at the door, its metal surface still marked with faint traces of frost. Then he looked back at the family resting on his floor. Outside, the world continued unaware. Inside, something rare was being protected by silence. The ranger station had known many kinds of silence. There was the empty kind that settled in after weeks without visitors. The sharp kind that followed storms, when even the wind seemed to step carefully. And the long, familiar quiet that came with routine, no engines, no voices, just the hum of isolation. This was none of those. This silence was full. Ethan moved slowly through the station that morning, each step measured not from fear, but from respect. The lioness remained in the far corner, her body forming a living wall around her cubs. She watched everything, though not constantly. Her eyes would close, then open again the moment Ethan shifted or reached for something. Not a challenge, a question. And each time Ethan answered it the same way, by keeping his voice low, by never rushing by, letting every action have purpose. He brewed coffee over the small camp stove, using one of the single-serve pouches he kept for long patrols. The familiar aroma filled the room, grounding him in something ordinary. As he stirred in powdered cream, his thoughts drifted uninvited to a life he had once imagined living differently. He wondered what Laura would say if she could see this now. She had always spoken plainly, as if truth were something sharp that needed no decoration. She would probably call him reckless first, irresponsible second. But underneath that, he suspected she would understand. She always had, even when she walked away. Ethan carried the mug back to the chair and sat cradling it for warmth more than taste. The lioness shifted slightly. One cub stretched, pressing its small body outward before curling back again. The sound it made was barely audible, softer than the crackle of the fire. It was enough to still him completely. Time passed in a way that felt unfamiliar, without schedules, without check-ins, without the weight of what came next. Ethan didn't write reports. He didn't open the door. He didn't reach for the radio, even when it briefly chirped with a distant signal. This space was fragile. He understood that now. The lioness slept more deeply as the hours passed. Her breathing slowed, muscles unfurling one by one. The cubs settled into a steady rhythm, nurse sleep shift closer, life reducing itself to its most essential needs. Ethan watched, and in watching he learned. He had spent years studying wildlife behavior, learning patterns, reading signs from a distance. But none of that had taught him what it meant to be present without control, to protect without possession, to care without claiming. At one point he reached for the medical pouch again, needing to check the wound once more before the day grew warmer. He spoke first quietly, giving her notice. "Just me." She didn't lift her head. He approached low and slow, gauze in hand. Her eyes remained closed. When he reached the edge of the bandage, he paused, waiting for any sign. Tension breath held too long a shift of weight. Nothing. He cleaned the skin gently and applied a thin layer of antibiotic ointment. It wasn't designed for animals like her, but infection followed the same rules everywhere. When he finished, he leaned back and rose carefully, his knees protesting as he stood. Age had a way of making itself known out here. Still, he smiled faintly to himself. Not many men could say they were spending Christmas guarding a wild family in the middle of nowhere. The afternoon light changed, sliding slowly across the floor. Outside, the reserve remained calm. No vehicles, no voices, just distant birds and the occasional whisper of wind. The lioness opened her eyes once and looked directly at him. Not for long. Just long enough. Then she lowered her head again, resting her chin fully on the floor. Ethan exhaled, unaware he'd been holding his breath. That small gesture said more than any sound could have. This was trust. Not dramatic, not loud, not something you could prove or explain. It was simply shared stillness. As evening approached, Ethan added another log to the stove and dimmed the lights, letting firelight carry the room. The station felt warmer now, but not just from heat. Something had settled between them, something delicate and real. For the first time in years, Ethan did not feel alone in the quiet. By nightfall, the ranger station felt transformed. Not in any visible way. The walls were the same dull metal. The floor still bore old scratches from boots and equipment. The stove hummed with the same steady heat it always had. And yet the space no longer felt like an outpost. It felt like a threshold. Ethan sensed it before he could name it. The lioness had changed. She was stronger now. Not healed, not fully, but steadier. Her movements carried intention again. When she shifted, it was no longer from discomfort alone, but from awareness. Her ears turned toward the door at the faintest sound outside. Her eyes followed the shadows that moved across the walls as clouds drifted past the moon. The cubs, too, were different. They stirred more often now, crawling clumsily over one another, pressing against their mother's side with growing confidence. One let out a thin, uncertain sound that echoed softly in the room. The lioness responded at once, lowering her head, guiding the cub back beneath her chest with a gentle nudge. Ethan watched from his chair, hands folded loosely in his lap. He knew this phase, not from experience like this, but from patterns he had seen his entire career. Recovery had its own rhythm. Shelter led to strength. Strength led to restlessness. And restlessness in wild creatures always pointed outward. The land was calling her back. He stepped quietly to the window and looked out across the reserve. The storm had scrubbed the desert clean. Snow lingered in shaded places, but the sky was clear now, stars sharp and countless above the ridgelines. Coyotes called in the distance, their voices carrying far in the cold air. This was her world, not steel floors, not controlled warmth, not human stillness. And yet, when Ethan turned back, a small part of him felt an unexpected ache. He had grown used to their presence more quickly than he cared to admit, used to the sound of breath in the room, used to sharing space without words. The lioness stood slowly, testing her injured leg. It held. She took a few careful steps, then paused. The cubs wobbled after her, unsteady and determined. She circled them once, then settled again closer to the door this time. Ethan understood the message. He didn't interfere. He didn't rush. He simply opened the door a few inches, enough to let fresh air spill in. The cold crept across the floor, carrying with it the sense of snowstone and distance. The lioness lifted her head, nostrils flaring as she breathed it in. Freedom! She did not leave. Not yet. Instead, she looked at Ethan, not as she had before. Not in need, not in surrender, but with something closer to readiness, the kind that comes before departure when a creature gathers itself for the next chapter of survival. Ethan nodded once more to himself, then to her. "Not tonight," he said quietly, "I know." The door remained open just long enough. Then he closed it again, sealing warmth inside. The lioness lay back down, curling around her cubs, but her sleep did not come as deeply as before. Neither did his. That night Ethan dreamed lightly, waking often to the sound of movement. Each time the family was still there. Each time he felt the weight of what was coming settle more firmly into place. This was never meant to be permanent. It was a pause, a mercy, a crossing of paths, and like all things in the wild, it would end when it was supposed to. The only question was how. Morning returned with clear skies and pale sunlight. The storm had fully released its grip on the land, leaving behind a desert that looked unfamiliar in its stillness. Snow clung to the shaded edges of rocks and shrubs, while the higher ridges glowed softly under the rising sun. The air was sharp, but calm, carrying that clean, high-altitude clarity that made every sound feel deliberate. Ethan stood by the window, a mug of coffee warming his hands, watching the horizon the way he always did. But today everything felt different. Behind him the lioness rose to her feet. The movement was smooth now, controlled. Her injured leg still bore the marks of healing, but it no longer trembled beneath her weight. Strength had returned to her frame, lean and focused, her posture no longer defensive but alert. Her ears flicked toward the outside world, catching sounds Ethan could barely register. The cubs followed her, unsteady but eager, their small bodies pressing close to her belly as if they understood something was about to change. Ethan set the mug down. He had known this moment was coming. He had felt it settle into his bones long before dawn. Wild things did not linger where safety was given freely. They returned to what shaped them. He stepped outside, leaving the door open. Cold air flooded the station, carrying scents of stone frost and open distance. Ethan walked a few steps into the clearing and stopped, giving the doorway space. He didn't speak. He didn't look back. Some moments didn't need instruction. Behind him he heard movement. The lioness reached the threshold and paused. The cubs hesitated at the change in surface, their tiny paws slipping slightly on the wooden floor. She waited patiently, watching them navigate the unfamiliar edge. One stumbled, then steadied. The other followed. They stood together in the doorway. For a long second nothing happened. Then the lioness turned her head, just enough. Her eyes met Ethan's across the narrow space between them. There was no tension in her gaze now, no fear, no need, only acknowledgement. The wind lifted the fur along her neck. She blinked once, slow and deliberate. Not farewell, not gratitude. Something simpler, older. Recognition. Then she stepped forward into the snow. The cubs followed, wobbling but determined, their small forms disappearing into the brush one careful step at a time. Ethan remained where he was watching, until the last movement faded into the landscape. The clearing fell silent again. When he returned inside, the station felt larger. Too large. The place where the family had rested bore faint impressions in the emergency blanket, subtle outlines that would disappear with time, but not with memory. Ethan gathered the supplies slowly. The bowl of water, the medical kit, the extra wood. Routine returned like a familiar weight, steadying and necessary. By mid-morning, the station looked almost as it always had. Almost. Ethan sat near the stove, hands resting on his knees, listening to the quiet he had once feared. But this quiet was different now. It carried meaning. Outside, the world moved on. Inside, something had changed that would not move with it. The weeks that followed settled back into routine. The roads cleared. The last traces of snow melted from the lower elevations. Radio check-ins returned to their predictable scheduled voices, crackling in and out with weather updates, patrol logs, and maintenance reports. The reserve stretched on as it always had, vast, quiet, indifferent. On the surface, nothing had changed. Ethan returned to his patrols, his data collection, his early mornings and long afternoons spent walking ridgelines and dry washes. He fixed trail markers knocked loose by the storm. He checked camera traps and satellite uplinks. He filed reports that were accurate, precise, and unremarkable. No one asked him about Christmas. No one needed to. When the district supervisor came through with new maps and field notes, Ethan answered every question in the same steady tone he always used. When the biologist reviewed migration data and predator movement patterns, he offered observations that fit neatly into expectations. There was no need to lie. The truth in its full shape simply did not belong on any form. Still, he carried it with him. Every time he poured coffee before dawn, every time he stepped outside and scanned the horizon as the light came up, he found himself watching the land differently now, reading it not just for signs of movement, but for memory. Once near the northern boundary of the preserve, he found tracks. 3 sets, one large, 2 smaller. They cut across a patch of soft earth near a dry creek bed, heading toward higher ground. Ethan crouched beside them, tracing the outline with his eyes, careful not to disturb the marks. The cub tracks were uneven, still learning their place in the world. He stood and moved on without following. Another evening, as the sun dipped behind the ridge, he heard a sound carry across the valley. It wasn't a warning. It wasn't a challenge. It was low, steady, and distant. A call. Ethan stopped and listened until it faded into silence. He did not answer. Whatever had passed between them belonged to another time, another place. The wild did not ask for repetition. Life continued. Until one afternoon when it didn't. Ethan had been on a solo patrol along the western trail, clearing debris left behind by the storm. The terrain was rough, a series of narrow ledges and loose gravel above a shallow gully. The sun was high, unusually warm for the season, and sweat gathered beneath his collar. He didn't see the edge until his boots slid. The ground gave way without warning. There was a brief, weightless moment of sky and stone, then impact. Pain tore through him sharp and blinding, followed by the unmistakable sound of bone meeting its limit. He landed twisted in the gully, breath driven from his lungs in a harsh gasp. His right ankle burned, the pain radiating upward with every pulse of his heart. The radio lay shattered a few feet away. No signal, no flare, no easy way out. Ethan lay still, the sun moving slowly overhead as minutes stretched into something heavier. He tried to shift, but pain flared white-hot, forcing him back. His mouth tasted of dust and metal. The reserve, so vast and familiar, suddenly felt indifferent, in a way that bordered on cruel. Then he heard it. At first he thought it was the wind, but the sound came again, low, rhythmic, deliberate. A call. His heart hammered as recognition cut through the haze. It didn't make sense. Weeks had passed. The land was wide. The odds were impossible. He told himself it was nothing, that pain had blurred his senses. The sound came a third time. Closer. Ethan forced his eyes open and looked toward the ridge. There, silhouetted against the lowering sun, stood the lioness. She looked stronger now, her coat clean, her posture confident. Behind her, 2 young lions watched from a safe distance, no longer newborns, but not yet the masters of the land they would one day become. She did not descend into the gully. She did not approach him. Instead, she lifted her head and called again, her voice carrying across the canyon in long, measured waves. Not for him, for someone else. Ethan's vision blurred as exhaustion took hold. He drifted in and out, the sound echoing through his thoughts like a memory made real. When he became aware again, voices reached him from above. Human voices. 2 rangers from the western checkpoint appeared at the edge of the gully, drawn by reports of an unusual animal call near the ridge. They descended carefully, secured him to a stretcher, and radioed for a rescue team. As they lifted him up the trail, Ethan turned his head one last time. The ridge was empty. Only stone and sky remained. But he knew, somewhere beyond his sight, the wild had remembered. Weeks later, Ethan returned to the ranger station on crutches. Winter was loosening its grip on the high desert. Snow had retreated to the peaks, and the ground outside the station carried the dull gold of early thaw. The cast on his ankle was stiff and heavy, a reminder of how quickly the land could reclaim anyone who underestimated it. Inside, everything looked the same. The stove, the desk, the narrow window facing the ridgeline. And yet the room carried an echo that no amount of routine could erase. Ethan eased himself into the old chair by the stove, resting his hands on the armrests as the familiar quiet settled around him. He had told the official version of his fall more than once. Loose gravel, bad footing, no radio signal, a standard rescue logged and filed. No one asked why a mountain lion had been reported calling repeatedly near the ridge that afternoon. No one pressed for explanations that had no language. The truth was not something meant to be shared. It was something meant to be carried. He spent his recovery days slowly returning to habit, logging data, reviewing trail footage, standing at the doorway each morning scanning the horizon as sunlight climbed the sky. Sometimes in the soft earth near the edge of the preserve he would find tracks. 3 moving together. He never followed them. That debt had already been answered. On quiet nights, when the wind moved gently across the desert and the station settled into its familiar stillness, Ethan would think back to that first knock. How easily he could have ignored it. How simple it would have been to keep the door closed and the rules intact. Instead, he had chosen to open the door. Not out of bravery, not out of duty, but out of recognition. The wild had trusted him once. And when the moment came, it remembered. Some debts are not written down. Some promises are never spoken, and some connections formed in silence last longer than anything that can be explained. That was the gift he carried forward. Not proof, not credit, just the knowledge that mercy, when offered without condition, sometimes finds its way back. This story reminds us that respect for nature goes beyond rules and observation. True stewardship means understanding balance, patience, and responsibility. Compassion does not weaken boundaries, it deepens them. When humans act with restraint and humility, coexistence becomes possible. Nature remembers action shaped by care even when no reward is expected. Protecting wildlife is not only about distance, but about knowing when presence, calm judgment, and ethical choice matter most. If this story touched something in you, leave a simple comment below.